Okay, welcome to 24 Hours of Past Summit 2015 preview. We're excited you could join us today for Edwin Sarmiento's session, Integrating SQL Server Analysis Services with Hadoop. This 24 Hours of Past event consists of 24 consecutive live webcasts delivered by expert speakers from the past community. This session is a preview of one of the many technical sessions that will be presented at Past Summit in October this year. Recordings will be available in 1 week at www.24hoursofpast.com. My name is Sandra Jackson Payton. I am a SQL Server DBA. I have been a dedicated database professional since 1998 and a data analyst for years prior to that. I have a few quick introduction slides before I hand over the reins to Edwin Sarmiento. He will speak for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll move on to the Q&A where you can ask them any questions you may have. If you have any questions or if you are experiencing any issues, just type your question into the question pane on the GoToWebinar control panel and someone will assist you. Feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A field at any time. Once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read off your questions to the speaker. Since all attendees are muted, you will need to submit your questions by typing in the Q&A field. Also, there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to complete it. It will appear in your web browser. "24 Hours of Past would not be possible without the support and dedication of our sponsors. They are the reason this event is available to you free of charge. I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsors, Microsoft, Dell Software, and Idera. In addition, I'd also like to thank the supporting sponsors for this event, HP, SQL Century, and Pyramid Analytics. Next, I'd like to bring your attention to the upcoming Past Summit, taking place in Seattle, Washington from October 27th to the 30th. Past Summit 2015 will feature over 200 sessions and world-class SQL Server experts. Planned and presented by the SQL Server community for the SQL Server community, Past Summit is single-handedly the largest gathering of SQL Server and BI professionals in the world. With over 5,000 registrants from all over the world, Past Summit is also a great place to network and meet face-to-face with experts, peers, and MVPs. More importantly, Past Summit delivers on providing you with the answers to your SQL Server issues, along with the knowledge, strategies, and skills you need to stay ahead of the curve. Save $200 right now by using the discount code 24HOP15 when you register. Optimize your savings by registering before the end of Sunday, September 20th. To find out more about the Past Summit, visit www.pastsummit.com. Make sure you explore everything Past has to offer for data professionals. You can join local user groups around the world, virtual chapters, find free online resources through our learning centers, and read up on the latest community news in the Connector newsletter. For those interested in business analytics, check out the Past Business Analytics Conference happening in May next year. Visit pastbaconconference.com. And so for more information or to subscribe to our bi-weekly BA Insight newsletter. Thought that was cute. And now, please allow me to present the speaker of the hour, Edwin Sarmiento.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And it's kind of hard to really guess where people are coming from. And really appreciate you coming to this session. Thanks, Sandra, for the introduction and for that wonderful cue about the PaaS community. I'll be doing a 40 to 45 minute presentation on integrating SQL Server analysis services with Hadoop. Now, if there's one thing to take away from what Sandra talked about for the past 5 minutes is be ready to take advantage of what the PaaS community has to offer. One of the biggest things that has really helped me a lot in my career is to being involved in the PaaS community. So if you can, this is a great opportunity. Sign up for the discount code for the PaaS Summit. I will be talking about integrating SQL Server analysis services with Hadoop. Just to give you a bit of a background, my key area of expertise is more on high availability and disaster recovery. You might be wondering, why did I even get involved with Hadoop? I started working with Hadoop last year when a customer of ours started looking at doing a proof of concept, and I started doing presentations on Hadoop because a lot of the presentations and the marketing that went around as far as Hadoop is concerned has a lot to do with the use of social media and how you can do your marketing and sales. There's a lot of buzzword in the community as far as Hadoop and the big data is concerned. My purpose when I started talking about Hadoop is to find use cases that matter to organizations. And so one of those things is just integrating Hadoop with your existing BI solutions. And so I want to talk about briefly how the Hadoop architecture and ecosystem looks like, and then how you could integrate SQL Server analysis services with Hadoop. But more than, if I'm not mistaken, more than 50% of this presentation will be demos. And I like doing demos because it gives you an opportunity to take a look at what this particular architecture looks like and how you can take advantage of it. So let's start off with the Hadoop architecture. I'm pretty sure that when you've probably seen this slide before, and you've seen how Microsoft has been touting this slide in just about any presentation that they have in terms of working with your traditional data warehouse, your traditional BI architectures and solutions, and then the introduction of non-relational, or should I say unstructured or non-structured data types. You've seen your traditional BI and analytics where you have self-service, your corporate, your existing BI tools are still there. In fact, I work with a lot of small and medium-sized businesses nowadays, being a business owner myself, and I tell them, look, Excel is your BI tool, and you already have it. It's just a matter of maximizing what you already have. If you're using Excel 2013 at least, you got Power Pivot, Power View, and you can download Power Query, and all of these plugins are there. You can take advantage of these tools and utilize them for looking at insights within your business. But again, going back to this slide on how the traditional BI has evolved. Now, when you think about it, in the traditional way of doing BI, you gather requirements about how do we build our data mart, how do we build our data warehouse, to a point where from the time you start building to the time the data warehouse is done, you probably spend like between 6 months to a year, ideally between 6 months to a year before we can finally come up with something. And in today's day and age where data is constantly being collected, the business processes may have changed between 6 months to a year, which means the structure or the schema that you built for your data marts, your data warehouses, and all your BI solutions between the span of 6 months to a year may or may not necessarily be relevant at the moment. And so there's this constant wave of data being collected, data being consumed, but we're not taking advantage of it. Hence, the entrance of the big data bandwagon. And when I say bandwagon, because everybody is talking about that. And we're not just talking about relational data anymore. It's 10 to 15 years ago, it was easy to say, hey, I know my business process. I can create a relational data model for capturing data. But now when you're looking at how fast you're collecting data, now in most cases, we're not even collecting data because we don't even know how to structure that. And that's where the non-relational, semi, or unstructured data comes into the picture. And this is where the big data and the Hadoop bandwagon come in, because now you have the opportunity to start collecting the data, even if you don't even know what to do about it at the moment. And then down the road, because you already have the data, you build a structure on top of it. It actually takes how we do the traditional way of data warehousing and a data structure in a different angle. Because back in the day, you create the schema, then you collect the data. Here, you collect the data, and then maybe down the road you think about how you come up with the schema to further analyze the data. And so we'll look at Hadoop in general. So just to come up with a general definition, now a lot of the purists will argue with me on this, but basically the way I see it, Hadoop is simply a collection of technologies starting from the underlying component, HDFS, the Hadoop Distributed File System. And HDFS, for a lot of DBAs and a lot of data professionals, it's kind of hard to understand. And I tell them this, look, if you have a removable hard drive, you plug it into your Windows file system. Think of the Hadoop file system as that hard drive. It's just a file system with files on it. But of course, it's totally useless unless you start plugging it into the underlying computer or operating system. And so the files in the Hadoop file system could be anything. Just like in a removable thumb drive, you could have text files, videos, PDF files, anything in the thumb drive. But what really makes a lot of these things work is when you start looking at those files and start performing analysis. And that's where HBase and MapReduce and Big and Hive come into the picture, because they're basically there to make sense of the data. So again, taking a step back, Hadoop is no more than a big distributed file system with different components running on top. So you can think of MapReduce and Yarn and Big and Hive as your Microsoft Word opening files within that thumb drive, your Microsoft Excel opening files, because a .xlsx file is nothing more than a file without Microsoft Excel. And so it's practically the same thing. You can store anything in the Hadoop file system, but they're totally meaningless without these components that you could use to further analyze these files. And so we're looking at the previous version, Hadoop 1.0, and now Hadoop 2.0. I think it's 2.7 something version at the moment. And you can do just about anything as far as data storage is concerned. So again, think about the fact that it's just a file system with built-in components on top to further analyze the files that you store in the file system. Let's take a look at the different components in the ecosystem. As I mentioned, Hive, what I'm going to be using for much of my demos, is more like a data warehousing language. I kind of look at it as the SQL for Hadoop. The reason I say that is because, I used to know Java. I did Java development before. But as a SQL Server professional, as a data professional, or as a business analyst, I probably know SQL. To select, insert, update, delete, and stuff like, I probably know that, but reinventing my skills to understand Java probably takes a while. And so Hive abstracts all of those Java codes. What you're simply doing is you're sending SQL-like syntax into Hadoop, and that gets translated into MapReduce jobs, which then gets sent to the underlying Hadoop file system, and then that gets translated, and then you get the results. But understand, Hive is a quicker way for us to learn and start working with Hadoop, because we already know the in our case, T-SQL constructs. It's easy to correlate those two because of what we understand about SQL. And then you got Pig Latin for those more complicated queries or more complicated processes that you want to write queries on top of and analyze Hadoop. And then you got Mahout, which is think of it this way, I kind of look at Mahout as more like the data mining version of Hadoop. So for advanced analytics, data mining, machine learning, that you could use Mahout for that. And then there's Scoop. I kind of look at Scoop and think of Scoop as SSIS for Hadoop. Would you do your ETL processes and all of that? Because there will be cases when you may want to leave the data in Hadoop, or maybe process the data in Hadoop and then the process data be stored in maybe your SQL Server database, your Oracle database, your MySQL database for ease of access. And then there's Oozie, or the workflow engine, kind of like your workflow engine that you built when you're creating SSIS packages. So these are just some of the common components that you can start working with when you're dealing with the Hadoop ecosystem. And just even looking at one of all of these components, you could really just specialize on Hive or just Scoop or any type of task that you want to accomplish within Hadoop. Now, I want to talk about some of the different offerings that are available here. Of course, I'm not here to sell or anything, but this is just one thing, because Hadoop is an open source project under the Apache organization. You have the flexibility of choosing which flavor you want to use. On-premise, these are the two most common ones. Cloudera, Hortonworks data platform are two of the more common ones. If you're a big Microsoft shop and you got like Windows engineers, you got to go with the Hortonworks data platform because they have a version or a flavor of Hadoop that works on top of Windows. In fact, Azure HD Insight is running, the Hortonworks data platform, and it's running on Azure. But this is the on-premise one. A lot of our customers have started using Cloudera because they were the first ones to get there. I kind of think of Cloudera's CDH as the Red Hat of Linux, because they started working with Hadoop earlier on in the process. They kind of gotten the early adopter advantage. But then, if you want to do POC and you don't want to spin up big machines, or even because spinning up an entire architecture. In fact, what I focused on when I started getting involved with Hadoop was primarily on the architecture side, building the servers, integrating them within the architecture and infrastructure. It's a lot of time and resources building. It's a big feat. And just to make sure that everything is working fine takes a lot of time. And so you can opt to do cloud implementations where you got on the Azure side or Microsoft Azure side the HD Insight service, or the Azure HD Insights offering, which is running the Hortonworks data platform on Windows Server 2012. But you also have options like Cloudera running on the cloud, and of course Amazon Web Services have their own offering. As I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing more on how you integrate this. Let's assume at this point that you already have a Hadoop platform, regardless of the flavor, regardless of the version, regardless of the operating system. Of course, if you want to run on Linux, go ahead, do that. It's, again, Hadoop is designed for Linux, and you can just take advantage of running on Windows if you want to. But let's take a look at how to integrate analysis services with Hadoop. Now, starting with, I think, SQL Server 2012, analysis services has been offered in terms of the traditional multidimensional and then tabular. And you got to look at it in terms of these two aspects, because you cannot have an analysis services with both tabular and multidimensional. You can either have one or the other. in which case, if you want to spin up an instance of analysis services, it could either be one of those two. It's either a multidimensional or a tabular. Now, there's quite a bit of a difference in terms of running analysis services in multidimensional versus tabular. When talking about multidimensional, there's just one extra piece in the puzzle. So think of the four server cluster on the left-hand side is your Hadoop cluster. What you do is you're running Hive queries, or you can run Hive queries against your Hadoop cluster. And you got to have a SQL Server database in between your analysis services and your Hadoop cluster. And that SQL Server database is primarily, number one, running the Hive Odbc. I'm going to talk about the Hive Odbc drivers. And you're creating a link server query to Hive, primarily because the multidimensional instance does not have a direct access to or does not have the right drivers for connecting directly to Hive Odbc. So you're looking at the SQL Server database instance as a pipe that connects analysis services to the Hadoop cluster. Now, again, this is just a pipe. It's just a means to connect to analysis services from the Hadoop cluster. But if you are going to be working with your tabular data model, I forgot to put that text there. If you're going to be working with a tabular data model, you don't really need the link server connection, because within the tabular data model, you have the option to connect directly to the Hadoop cluster using Hive Odbc driver. Now, the clients could be anything. What I'm going to show you here is we're going to create projects within the SQL Server data tools. But you could do, within Tabular, you could do Excel, Power Pivot, or even Power Pivot for SharePoint. In fact, some of the icons that I used there were Power Pivot for SharePoint. In fact, I think last year at the past DA conference, I showed one of my presentation was all about how you can integrate Hadoop with SharePoint 2013 in terms of the BI offering. So just to cap the key difference between the two, if you're dealing with tabular data models, you don't need that extra step. You don't need that pipe or that link server connectivity between your SQL Server analysis services and Hadoop. Could be direct, but with multidimensional, you definitely need that. And so let's take a look at some of the Hive Odbc drivers. What you're simply doing here is you're installing the drivers so that you could connect to the Hadoop cluster. Now, depending on what version or what flavor of Hadoop that you're going to be using, I so recommend that you download and use the right one. I'm referencing the Microsoft's Hive Odbc driver that you can download from Microsoft Download Center. And that Hive Odbc driver works for just about any flavor, but my approach has always been use what the vendor has actually created for that specific flavor. In fact, the one that I'm using, because I'm using the Cloudera, the Cloudera's version of Hadoop, I'm actually using the Hive Odbc drivers for Cloudera. And I'm going to show you how you can configure that within Odbc, and I'm going to show you also how you could use that to connect to Hadoop later on. Now, you could also use the Hortonworks Data Platform. The key point that I'm trying to make is use the right driver for the specific flavor of Hadoop that you're going to be using. Now, of course, development would be totally different in terms of your environment, my environment. The one key thing that I follow in terms of development is, number one, because SSDT is still 32-bit driver or application, you got to have the 32-bit Odbc driver installed on your development workstation. Of course, on your production workstation, production environment rather, you got to have the 64-bit, depending on what your operating system is and what your platform running is. So I'm going to show you how we can start working with big data using HDFS and Hive. Now, let me quickly, and before I do that, let me just show you as well. The second demo would be how to integrate Hadoop with SQL Server Analysis Services. So let me jump into my demo environment real quick. And what you're seeing here is a Windows Server 2012 R2 machine. In fact, this is the development machine where I've taken the liberty of logging into the Hadoop cluster. In fact, what you're seeing here is the Cloudera's Quick Start VM that you can download off of the Cloudera website. I've taken the liberty of grabbing some of the things that I need and storing it in Hadoop. Now, let me give you an overview of the demo that I'm going to show you. A lot of the use cases that you'll see out there is processing logs, web server logs, or even social media and whatever. The use case that I am going to use is I wanted to process the web server logs primarily because I want to correlate the activities on my e-commerce website to the sales that I'm generating from that particular website. So what I simply did is I copied some of the files, and they're already in this folder. So these are IIS web server logs that I copied off from web servers into Hadoop. You could do that via Scoop. You can do that via Uzi, depending on how you want to get your web servers into Hadoop. But the point of the matter is I've already taken advantage of the fact that I've copied everything. In fact, for simplicity's sake, I just copied an entire folder into Hadoop. And what I did in the process is after copying those files into Hadoop, is I've created a query or a table-like structure. So I copied the files from my web servers into the Hadoop file system, and I've created a table-like structure to look at the files. Now think about this. Because I'm copying those files into my Hadoop file system, think about how you're copying files into your hard drive. You need something to take a look at those files. So imagine Hive being the Word document or the PowerPoint or the Notepad, if you want to look at that, to view the data and to start analyzing it. So what I did was to start creating a structure of table. You might want to look at it as a view because I'm not really creating a table. I'm just creating a schema, excuse me, for that particular set of files. So I'm creating the structure with log date and so on, stored as text file in this particular location. User, root, IS logs. So basically what this is doing, as I mentioned, is just creating a view because the files are still going to be files. And Hadoop will start looking at those files, opening those files, and start processing them. Oh, wait a second, that's going to take a while. And which is why we're creating this particular structure so that the analysis later on, when you start doing the aggregation and all of that, could be stored temporarily, the results of which could be stored temporarily as a file on whatever location within your Hadoop file system would be stored. I've also created a main table, so that's the staging table, the IIS log staging, and I've also created the IIS_log table, which I will use for the analysis. So this is more like the same structure, but with more aggregation. What I did was after I've created the structure, I've started inserting records that have aggregated the contents from all those text files into that particular table. and you see the results. Of course, I could always run some queries against it. For example, show tables. I've got two tables in here, IS logs and IS log staging, and I am within the Hive command line interface at the moment. I could run. So, if you notice, this is a typical common T-SQL construct that I could use. We're familiar with that. We're familiar with using the select, insert, and update, create table statements, because this is something that we've used in the relational database world. I don't know if it is seen in environment, but it tells me that Hive is a deprecated language. It says there Hive CLI is deprecated, and you can use Beeline for that purpose. And true, you could use Beeline as well. So Beeline is more of the way the Hive command line interface is heading towards. What you're seeing in this particular window is Hive CLI. It's the command line interface for executing Hive query language against Hadoop. And because it's almost deprecated, it is recommended you move towards Beeline. But the point that I'm trying to make here is it's pretty much the same as running your typical SQL statements. Your selects, your inserts, updates, and deletes. You could do the exact same thing within Beeline if you want to. Let's try to connect first to Beeline. And notice that a lot of these are simply Java constructs for connecting. Connect. And the same thing. You could execute a Hive query language as if you are within Hive. Select star from IS log. And the only reason I'm limiting the output is I don't want to be spending so much time waiting for the results. Imagine waiting for 3.213 seconds just to get 5 records. So moving on, I wanted to show you these two windows, the Odbc Data Source Administrator window, where you're seeing my Microsoft Hive Odbc driver. Of course, this window is for 64-bit, while this one's for 32-bit. A Hive Odbc driver for what I'm using, because I'm connecting to a Cloudera version of Hadoop, and I could create a Hive Odbc driver that points to my Hadoop cluster. And I want to name this maybe CDH 5.4 because I'm using version 5.4, and want to connect to my my server. Maybe I'll use just Hive server 1. Authentication, username, and password. So what I'm basically doing here is I'm creating an Odbc connection between the workstation that I'm working on, and later on when you're deploying your solution on the analysis services instance to connect to your Hadoop cluster. So I provided my the IP address, or this could be a DNS name. Used Hive server 2 provided the credentials to connect to my my Hadoop cluster, and making sure that, of course, my connectivity is successful. Now, this is for 64-bit. Keep in mind that because SQL Server Data Tools, or whatever version you're using, I'm using 2013, is a 32-bit application, so you might as well create a 32-bit version of that. I'm going to finish, call it the same thing, and provide the IP address, my authentication. And again, the only reason I'm doing this is because this is both my development and my deployment environment. But just wanted to point out that initially, for development purposes, you got to create a 32-bit version so that SSDT would work properly with your environment. So let's take a look at the multi-dimensional analysis services instance. What I have in here is both your traditional multi-dimensional instance and a tabular instance of analysis services. So let's start off with multi-dimensional. As I mentioned earlier, you got to create a link server query or a link server that would connect your analysis services instance excuse me, to your Hadoop cluster. Let's call this SQL to Hadoop, Odbc driver, data source, should be your DSN, system DSN name, CDH or 5, then provider string, and so on and so on. With security, you may be using the security context of the one that we provided when we connected using the Odbc driver. And I've already created a T-SQL script for that, which is this. I'm just going to copy that over real quick. And create the link server query. Done. So now I have the link server connection. We can always test the connection. Oops. Copies. Hive CDH. Oh. Should be 5-4, not 5_. Configure. Or better yet, let me just delete and recreate it. And name it _. And make sure that the connection is properly tested. There we go. And because we already have, the link server connection between a SQL server and the Hadoop cluster, we can start executing queries against it. So one way to test is to run a very simple query. So what you're seeing is simply a link server query to my Hadoop cluster using the Hadoop Hive Odbc driver. Now, of course, this is going to take a while because it's sending the query to the Hive Odbc driver, connect to the Hadoop cluster, and realize it took 0.08 seconds just to get 5 records. But because we already have that connectivity between SQL Server and Hadoop, we can create views. Now we can create views, and why don't I just do that? We can create views that we could use, which contains the query that we had earlier. So what I'm simply doing here is I'm aggregating the log date from all the web server logs, looking at page hits, and then aggregating that from all of those files. Now keep in mind, this is a view that we've created on all of the different web server logs in Hadoop. So creating this view will take a while. Now you might be thinking, why do I have this? Well, for one, if depending on how you want to create your view, is you also need to map your data types from within your existing data models or the data models that you're going to create. And so let me just quickly create this. And that is totally up to you on how you want to do the data type conversion. In this case, I'm just casting as date. Could be date time, could be any date type, but let's take a look at the view. Oops. Let's take a look at the view that got created. Stage data type for that is date time 2. You might want to tweak that particular data type depending on what data type you use for the columns that you use for, building the data model. So that's that for the link server. We've created the link server. We've created a view on the data warehouse. Now let's start integrating analysis services within this particular environment. So I'm going to create a new project within SQL Server Data Tools. And let's start with multi-dimensional. I'm going to name this SSAS Hadoop. So let's start with creating a data source. Now keep in mind, because we already have a link server connection from our SQL Server database to the Hadoop cluster, all we got to do now is just use that link server query instead of connecting to Hadoop directly, because I don't really have the Odbc driver here as of yet, so I'm taking advantage of that link server query. I'll use the credential of or better yet, so this is just the credential that you will use to connect to the SQL Server instance that has the link server connection. Of course, it's really not a good security practice to use administrator account, but I'm logged in as the administrator at the moment. So I now have this, the AdventureWorks DW connection, which is a connection to my SQL Server database, which hosts the link server query. Let's create a data source view. Within the data source view, I'm going to select my existing one. What I'm going to choose here is the view that I created. And the view that I created, of course, runs a link server query to my Hadoop cluster. Let me add that. Let's say I want to do additional analysis. I want to do dim date. And because I'm analyzing my web server logs, let me bring in my fact internet sales. Next, finish. Again, the primary reason why we need to build that link server query between analysis services and the Hadoop cluster via the SQL Server database is because it does not analysis services, the Odbc drivers are not supported within the multi-dimensional model, and thus the link server query is just there as a stopgap. You could bridge your analysis services instance and your Hadoop cluster. Of course, once that's done, you can start creating your models, building your cubes, and then when you do the deployment, as I mentioned while I'm waiting for this, when you do the deployment, because you're working with SSDT, which requires a 32-bit driver, you are going to need a 64-bit version of the Odbc connection to your Hadoop cluster. So that's done. Again, you can start working with your models and building their relationships. But that's for the multi-dimensional model. Let me create a new one for just to show you the difference between the multidimensional and the tabular model. So let me select a tabular model. EB for tabular or tabular. Create that. I want to save the changes. Yes, I want to do save the changes. So just to show you the difference, and I'm going to use tabular. I'll keep the compatibility level to 2012. And within the model, I can do import from data sources. Notice that I've got the Odbc driver for this. And that is the big difference between using the multi-dimensional mode versus the tabular mode, where in the tabular mode, you have the option to choose the Odbc driver from within SSDT. And we'll start building this. Odbc drivers. And I'm going to select the one that I created. Notice that it's only showing me the options I have for that specific version. We'll use the credentials, test connection. Just want to make sure that my connectivity works fine. Make sure that you click on allow saving password. Check. I always get this urge to click that test connection button just to make sure the connectivity is working fine. Specific Windows user name and password. Now keep in mind that the data source does not live on a Windows machine. It's running on a Linux platform. The Cloudera's Quick Start VM is actually running on Linux. So I don't really need that, but for additional security, you could do pass-through. But this is for development purposes. I just usually use the service account because this isn't the one that I use to connect to the Hadoop cluster. I want to select from a list of tables, and you should see, unlike what we saw earlier, we're connecting to the data warehouse. I'm now simply connecting directly to my Hadoop cluster. Let me grab the IIS_log, noise preview filter, and you can take a look at what's in there, similar to what you've seen when I was executing Hive query language earlier. And finish. So I'll just walk you through the process of configuring Hive Odbc drivers, just again making sure that you download the right driver and the right version. For development purposes, you need to make sure that you have the 32-bit drivers installed on your development machine, but on your deployment environments, your production environments, you got to need the appropriate version, whether it's 32-bit or 64-bit. Now, if you're looking at the process here, it's actually retrieving all of those records in excuse me, in the Hadoop cluster and bringing it into the data model. That's done. Oops. So now you can start adding and mashing up some of your data. For example, you could always import the data from your existing SQL Server instance. So what I'm simply doing here is I'm bringing in, excuse me, I'm simply bringing data from my existing data warehouse, combining that with my data from Hadoop, and we can start again doing dim date, fact internet sales. Let's just use that for a while and import that into the data model. Of course, from there on, you can start building your data model, provided, of course, that the data types that you have on your existing tables within your data warehouse match that from what you've imported from Hadoop. So now I've got like the data coming from, excuse me, from my Hadoop cluster, the data from my traditional data warehouse. And then you can start building the data model and the relationship between, excuse me, your the data coming from the Hadoop cluster and your traditional data warehouse. All right, so you've seen how let me take a step back. You've seen how I've worked with, putting files on Hadoop, although I didn't show you that, but started working with files within the Hadoop file system, Hadoop distributed file system. You've seen how I could start running Hive query language against the data within my Hadoop. You've seen how we could integrate analysis services, whether it's in multidimensional or in tabular mode, and then integrating that within Hadoop, noting the difference between multidimensional and tabular, where in multidimensional you need to have that extra step of building that link server query just to bridge analysis services and your Hadoop cluster. Whereas in tabular mode, because you already have that Odbc driver, that support for Odbc, you can directly connect to your Hadoop cluster from tabular mode. In fact, Power Pivot uses the exact same thing, where you could connect from Excel. You can connect directly to your Hadoop cluster. If you have questions regarding this presentation, feel free to type those questions on the chat window. We'll be more than happy to answer those questions. And like what was mentioned earlier, I'm going to be doing this session at the PASS Summit together with a professional development session as well. It is an experience of a lifetime. I first started attending the PASS Summit back in 2007. I've always gone whenever I can ever since. I kind of tell people the SQL Server community is way, way different than the other technical communities out there, in a way that it feels like a homecoming reunion for family, and it's an experience. It's really not that easy to explain, but I would certainly recommend it to go and attend if you can. So take advantage of the discount code by using the 24 hours of PASS or 24 HOP15 code when you register for the PASS Summit. And if you do have any questions, feel free to ask those questions on the chat window. You can also connect with me on Twitter, on LinkedIn. I blog on a regular basis on topics about SQL Server, high availability, and disaster recovery. You might be wondering why Hadoop. Well, Hadoop is a high availability, highly available cluster. And it's also one of the reasons why I really focused on the infrastructure side of things in the Hadoop environment.
Okay, that was a wonderful job, and we thank you so much for making the presentation. It's just packed full of information. Again, if you did like what you heard, Edwin will be presenting at the PASS conference in 2015, and his general sessions are that integrated SQL Server analysis services with Hadoop, and from technician to CEO, a roadmap to advancing your career. It's about life balance. If you like to get a discount, use discount code 24 HOP15 to save $200, and you can also see how to contact Edwin if you have questions on his Twitter, his LinkedIn, or on his blog. That information is presented there. This is the time for you to ask your questions. We have some questions that have already been asked, and let's see. We have some questions. Bill Anton asked two questions. The first question that Bill asked was, can the SQL Server instance running Hive Odbc driver be standard edition?
That is a great question. And any edition that supports link server queries is good enough. And again, the reason I say that is, of course, you're really not using SQL Server as a database engine. You're simply using the capabilities to connect to the Hadoop cluster via the link server queries. So any edition that supports link servers is good to go. I don't know if Express Edition actually has that feature, but I haven't tested. But Standard Edition and higher works.
Oh, very good. The next question by Bill was, is there a noticeable performance impact for pulling data through the intermediate SQL Server with Hive Odbc driver during queue processing? If so, roughly how significant?
That's a great question, and from my experience, here's what I've noticed. In the earlier versions, I started using, I think, 2.0 of Hadoop. It was significantly slower, and the reason I say it's significantly slower is because of the fact that Hadoop is a file system. Think of it this way: if you've got thousands and thousands of files in there that you're trying to process, it will go ahead and crack open those files, read those files, and do the aggregation and analysis for you. And that's significantly slower, and that's one of the reasons why you don't just spin up a 2-node, 4-node cluster, because you want to split the compute across all of those. Now, along the way, the Hadoop community has improved performance in terms of how they process that. In fact, if you noticed, it used to take me about 67 seconds. In one of my notes when I did this presentation last year, it used to take like 67 seconds to run a select star from one table, and I'm only retrieving 5 rows. Imagine how long will that take if I am opening up thousands and thousands. I've only got like 300 files in my Hadoop cluster, but imagine how that performance would look like if you're opening up thousands of files. But now it has significantly improved. There will still be performance difference, but at the end of the day, of course, you're trying to bring in data from your Hadoop cluster into your analysis services instance. So if you're doing a data refresh, that is the only time that your users, or of course they don't have to experience that. What you can do is you can automate the process of doing the data refresh, maybe on off-peak hours in the day. And when that's done, of course, the users will simply connect to the analysis services instance, and of course that's way faster.
Okay, great. That's a lot of information. There's another question by Slava, and the question is it possible to link to Hadoop directly from SSIS to read-write without creating link server?
Great question. You're talking about SSIS. Now, integration services, you do have the opportunity to connect to that with the right drivers, but keep in mind, Hadoop was primarily designed as an append-only file system. What I mean by that is, of course, you simply write the files, and then if you want to do some changes to it, you're not overwriting the existing data that you have in your Hadoop cluster. You're simply adding on to it. And so if you look at the nature of a typical transaction, say somebody buys off of your website and then they changed it, you don't actually change the price when they buy. You're changing the transaction by adding into it, because you kind of look at it in terms of the history of the transaction. So the way Hadoop works is that it's designed to be append only. So going back to your question about SSIS, you can, but it's again an append only approach where you're extracting data from Hadoop, doing the processing, and putting it back in. But then there's Scoop for it, which is designed specifically for that. I know a lot of people are starting to use SSIS for ETL, but of course the Hadoop community is still using Scoop. But it's totally up to you. The underlying motivation behind choosing which one is which is, number one, your skill set. Are you more comfortable with SSIS, or do you want to explore Scoop? And of course, the second one would be performance. At the end of the day, once you've gotten a hold of the skill set for both SSIS and Scoop, then comes testing. Which one's faster? Which one can, which of Scoop or SSIS can perform the task faster and more efficient?
Okay, wonderful. The next question is from Diana. Can you import/analyze streaming data that are stored in Hadoop in tabular / multidimensional?
Great question. It's easier said than done. And the reason for that is, of course, the nature of streaming data. And this is where, excuse me, where Uzi comes in. The nature of streaming data is when data comes in, it's not necessarily real time when you do the analysis, because by the time you perform the analysis, the data may or may not have come in. And so while you can do that, given the right architecture and the right infrastructure, the right design, it's easier said than done. And so even when people talk about your Twitter feeds because they're real time and Facebook comments, although they're real time, there's a lot of moving parts that come in when you start processing that, and we're not even we're only talking about Hadoop here, because again, this is where you start implementing workflows using Uzi, and you start building all of those components to make that happen. But yes, you can. It's really a matter of how you design your entire infrastructure.
Okay, great. We have several more questions. There's a question from Karan. Do we need to create same Odbc DSN name in 32 versus 64-bit?
Great question. Yes, you do. And the reason for that is when you build your connection, you've seen me both on the multidimensional and tabular mode where I've specifically specified the name of the Odbc DSN. Now, on the multidimensional mode, the Odbc DSN is the name, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why the connection failed the first time I did it. I used a different name, and so I can't connect to it. So the reason for that is when you start deploying your analysis services solution, that connection string is going to be embedded in your project and your deployment, in which case, if that connection string parameter does not exist, it won't be able to connect.
Okay, very good. Next question. Naga asks, can I opt for direct query option in Hadoop data source?
I don't quite understand what you mean by direct query, but if you mean running Hive QL against Hadoop, yes, you can do that. And Power Pivot and Excel has that capability where you can type in Hive query languages. The only difference, of course, is, let me jump back to my demo environment. The big difference there is how you may want to use those implementation, because when you look at the configuration, there's an advanced option, native query. If you noticed, because I'm using Hive query language, or rather the Hive Odbc driver, I only execute the common SQL constructs. But if I check this option, I'm forced to only execute Hive query language, which means there won't be any translation between the queries that I execute within SQL Server or my data warehouse and my Hadoop cluster. So yes, you can do that via Hive QL directly. Go ahead.
Well, Naga was explaining that direct query means live connection, and with SSS, so they browse real time. So they just elaborated a little bit more.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So yes, you can. One option, as I mentioned, is by doing this. So this is a live query using Hive query language using my Hive command line interface.
Okay, very good. Very good. The next question is from Ivo Linting. Can we use Polybase to use T-SQL instead of Hive queries?
Very good question. Now, if we were in 2014, I would say probably not, because Polybase is only available within PDW. out that SQL Server 2016, I don't know what they're going to call it, but in SQL Server 2016, you now have the option to run Polybase and emulate how Hadoop looks like. So imagine Polybase like Hive that executes those queries against excuse me, against Hadoop clusters. In fact, I'm writing a series of articles on an introduction to Polybase on the mssqltips.com website. So yes, you can, but the architecture is going to be a bit more complicated because we're still waiting for Microsoft on what the addition of SQL you need and what else it needs to be there, because you got to think of it in terms of compute. You're executing queries through Polybase against a Hadoop cluster. Now, Hadoop cluster, of course, is independent of Polybase. It's just an intermediary level like Hive is.
Oh, very good. Very good. There is another question from Praveen V, and asking, do the queries run through linked server take advantage of Hadoop's parallel processing?
Very good question. I actually had that question as well, but I haven't heard from a product team. So I will get back to you when I hear back from the product team. Because you're right. I definitely need to know if that does that. But keep in mind, because it's executing Hive query language under the covers, and this is just my assumption based on how it works. Because you're executing Hive query language, the Hive query language gets sent to the name node, and the name node will then decide how do I split this query up. And so because your Odbc link server queries are executed towards the name node, so there's parallel execution on the Hadoop itself, on the Hadoop cluster itself. But coming back, that's where I'm a bit confused as to whether or not it's executing the parallel query execution. But on the Hadoop side, of course, it does happen. And that's what Hadoop is for.
Okay, very good. The next question is from Uday, and they ask, can we have proactive caching enabled on these? One moment. Can we have proactive caching enabled on these cubes to fetch the data from OLTP with a real-time frequency like normal OLAP, OLTP implementation?
Depending on, I'm looking at which version of SQL Server that you can do that, but depending on the version, you can. But can you expound a bit more on proactive caching? What do you mean by proactive caching?
I'm going to ask right now. While we're waiting for that response, let me ask another question from Hubert. There is a Azure package for SSIS allowing connectivity to Hadoop. And so I think it's more of a statement, but it says there is a Azure package for SSIS allowing connectivity to Hadoop. Is that true?
That I'm not sure of. I was thinking of using HD Insight. In the past, I used HD Insight for some of my demos, but because sometimes my internet connection is not that stable, I try to avoid that. In fact, what you're seeing is a Hadoop, it's a Cloudera distribution running off of my my virtual environment.
Okay, very good. Okay, we are still waiting for Uday to reply. The next question is from Olak, and he states that I'm a T-SQL developer and have installed SQL Server 2012 on the machine. My question is how to start Hadoop on a standalone machine. What are software and tools required to install setup on a local machine?
Great question. Here's my advice. Because you're a developer, just download any of the test environments that are available from both Cloudera and Hortonworks. And the reason for that is because Hadoop is an ecosystem in of itself, a lot of the developers that I've talked to have they're confused about how the whole thing works. And if your goal is to simply learn how to write applications and to code and integrate that within your BI infrastructure, I don't recommend that you start off with learning the architecture. A lot of the documentation and resources out there talks about the architecture and how everything works. It becomes confusing from a developer point of view. So what I would recommend is that you download what I'm using right now is the Cloudera Quick Start VM. It's available in VMware, I think in VirtualBox version as well. So just go to the Cloudera website or just do a quick search on Cloudera Quick Start VM, and you can download that VM. You can start working with that VM. The good thing about it is their distribution, their Linux distribution, has the X Windows package installed, and so you could use the graphical user interface for most of the stuff that you want to do, and they have everything that you need within the VM. So the tools that you need for getting ramped up with learning HiveQL, Uzi and Scoop and stuff like that. But keep in mind, because it's in a Linux environment, you got to be very comfortable with the Linux environment, and with the integration at like what I did, if you want to run let's say integration between SQL Server, because it's Linux, you can install SQL Server within that. So that you got to have a separate environment for developing your applications within Windows that talks to a Hadoop cluster.
Well, that was a great answer. There is it's about time to wrap up. I have two more questions, and one of them is a response from Uday, who said that, initially Uday said this, and he asked this question: can we have proactive caching enabled on these cubes to fetch the data from OLTP with the real-time frequency like normal OLAP and OLTP implementation? But when we asked him for more information, Uday indicated changes happen to OLTP data will be fetched to OLAP databases with the predefined frequency. With proactive caching settings, MOLAP, is there a way to implement the same with this setup?
Great question, and I could expound more on that, but if you just send me an email, I know we've run over, we need to wrap up, but again, send me an email with that question. My email is Edwin at edwinmsarmiento.com. I could explain more about how the whole thing works, because basically it's just multidimensional, and it's just connecting to a data source.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your information. I know everyone learned something. I did. And we thank all of you for attending. And please be sure to remember to come and see Edwin at the conference for the PASS Summit 2015. We thank you so much again.